Let's go back to yesterday.
Right.
Way back at yesterday, you announced a very big arrangement with a Chinese company, almost $1 billion fine, actually,
Right.
for violating sanctions with Iran. Explain to us that transaction and how that fits in a Chinese trade policy, or does it at all? Is it just a one-off?
Well, people don't realize it, but Commerce Department has many, many divisions, one of which is the Bureau of Industrial Security, and I'm wearing their little lapel pin now in honor of what they did yesterday. The job of that group is to make sure that sensitive materials, particularly highly technological materials, don't get into the wrong hands. ZTE had the exact opposite game plan. They were dealing repeatedly with Iran, repeatedly with North Korea, and despite the sanctions in both cases. So this is a case been going on for quite a few years. And I'm very proud that the department only has 20 agents in that particular segment. And this is not the only case. You're going to see more cases because there have been other violators of the sanctions.
And you and the president are pretty outspoken about our relations with China when it comes to trade. Is there a special, particular focus of commerce on these sorts of possible violations for Chinese companies?
Well, for any companies, we're not discriminating against the Chinese. Anybody who violates the sanctions, we will deal with harshly.
So let's turn now to Mexico and Nafta, another very big item on the agenda. It's been clear, the president's made it very clear, he wants to renegotiate NAFTA. As you go into those negotiations, there's also this proposal for a border adjustment tax up on the Hill. Unclear what the White House's position is, as I understand, unclear what your position is. How do you make assumptions about a border adjustment tax as you negotiate with Mexico? Do you assume there will be one, there won't be one, or do you wait?
Well, the kinds of things we have to deal with in the Mexican and Canadian negotiations are really not related to the border adjustable tax. The genesis of the border adjustable tax is as much the need for revenue as part of the new tax bill as it is anything else. It's not intended principally as a trade activity. It will obviously have an impact on trade, but that's not its main origin. So the Mexican situation is the following. It's an old treaty. Our economy is very different from what it was when that treaty was entered into. You didn't have the whole digital economy. Services were not nearly as important as they are now. And further, we've now had decades of experience with the treaty. Very hard to get a several thousand-page document right at inception. And there were some things in it that were missed. There were some things in it that were not done correctly to begin with, and a lot of things that might have been okay back then, but don't work now. So there's a lot to fix.
And both the Canadian government and the Mexican government have said things like that. They say it has an old treaty. There's room for negotiation. There are gives and takes we can have. That's one model. Another model is we have a substantial trade deficit with Mexico that we have to fix. Which one is driving the Department of Commerce?
Both.
So are you really targeting the trade deficit? Because as you look at trade deficit, it actually has not risen with Mexico over the course of NAFTA. The imports and the exports have both increased, but the overall trade deficit hasn't changed much.
Well,
but why are we targeting
that?
That's
really not true. Pre-NAFTA, we regularly had a trade surplus with Mexico. Now we regularly have a substantial trade deficit with Mexico. So it's not true that pre-NAFTA and post-NAFTA, there's no change. There's a big change.
So one of your goals is to reduce, if not eliminate, that trade deficit with Mexico.
Absolutely. We think there's no logical reason why one country, namely the U.S., needs to have a trade deficit that roughly equals the combined trade surplus of the rest of the world. It's not our fate in life that we have to absorb all the net exports from everyone else.
In order to get those sorts of concessions out of Mexico, there will have to be some threats, I don't think it's too strong a word, made about tariffs, whether it's border adjustment tax or something else. Could that really disrupt trade overall with Mexico? What does it mean for example, a General Motors?
Well, first of all, I'm not a very threatening figure. So I don't know about the word threat, but the reality is the Mexicans know, the Canadians know, everybody knows times are different. we are going to have new trade relations with people, and they all know they're going to have to make concessions. The only question is what's the magnitude and what's the form of the concessions. I've told the president repeatedly, he's made my job a lot easier by softening up the adverse parties. What could be better than going into a negotiation where the fellow on the other side knows he has to make concessions?
What is the time horizon now? When would you expect the negotiations to begin, and how quickly would you like to get them resolved?
Well, I'd like to get the results tomorrow, but that's not the way that the world works. We're now in the early stages of the TPA process, the Trade Promotion Authority, the so-called fast track. And that process, by its own nature, has a couple of months starting point before anything very serious happens. So you're talking probably the latter part of this year before real negotiations get underway.
So you know from your prior role, as I said, a very successful investor, business really doesn't like uncertainty. When they make investment decisions, they like to know what's happening. Right. There's a lot of urgency on the part of American business and financial markets, for that matter, to get this thing resolved, to know what we're dealing with.
Well, they don't have any more sense of urgency than I do, and you're well aware the president has a well-documented sense of urgency as well.
We're here with U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross, and we want to welcome once again our Bloomberg radio audience as well as TV. So we're going to get this done as quickly as we can. Do you have a sense at this point of what the major sticking points are likely to be? Do you have targets? For example, rules of origin, environmental restrictions. There have been a list of things that people have suggested should be taken a look at.
Well, there were roughly 20 chapters to the original Nafta. And there are several chapters that need to be added because of the digital economy and other things that have developed subsequently. So there are myriad points of discussion that will come. Which ones will bear the most fruit is a little bit premature to discuss, but there's a lot of meat to be dealt with.
As you go into these negotiations, how mindful are you of the possibility of what the markets talk about as a trade war, where sanctions would be taken that might escalate, go to WTO, there would be reciprocal sanctions, things like that? How mindful are you of that danger?
Well, we're in a trade war. We've been in a trade war for decades. That's why we have a deficit. The difference is our troops are now coming to the ramparts. That's the only change.
But it sounds like it's going to be a shooting war now.
No, it's not going to be a shooting war. If people know you have the big bazooka, you probably don't have to use it.
So you are reasonably confident we'll come up with a revised NAFTA that will substantially reduce trade deficit with Mexico within the year?
Well, I think the negotiations hopefully won't take more than a year. How long it will take to implement them and to get the reductions, that's a different question. These are very complicated issues. For example, you mentioned rules of origin, and that certainly will be a big topic. But you have to be mindful also of the supply chains that have developed, and to the degree that a transition, geographic transition is needed, that takes some time.
Well, you mentioned the supply chain, which is very much on the minds of a lot of U.S. business, as you know.
Sure.
I mean, I'll pick on Mary Barra just because she has spoken out about this, and GM has a particularly complicated situation with shipping parts back and forth across the border.
Right.
To what extent are you hearing from U.S. business, and are they playing a constructive role in saying this is how you could accomplish your goals, but consistent with what we need to do as a business?
Well, they're all nervous because, as you mentioned, uncertainty is the big curse of any business. But frankly, it's a big curse of government, too. Government doesn't like uncertainty any more than business leaders do. So we will try to get it resolved as rapidly as we can. And we will be consulting with the industries that could be affected. Part of this whole TPA process is consultation with the domestic industry, both getting recommendations from them as to changes they would like, and hearing through the problems, the issues that some of the changes might create for them.
We tend to focus on Mexico, but of course NAFTA is a trilateral agreement.
It is.
Do you anticipate the negotiations will be three-part negotiations with people, bartering across borders?
Well, the president has indicated his general preference for bilateral, but we're open-minded about the form in which the NAFTA discussions will take. The most important thing is the end result, not whether it's a bilateral or a trilateral arrangement.
I want to come back to border adjustment tax. Have you taken a position? Do you have a view about the border adjustment tax?
Yes, my view is that I'm studying it very carefully as it evolves. And as we get to understand more the intricate details of it and how it interacts with everything else, that's when we'll take a position.
And you suggested, as I understand quite correctly, that Speaker Ryan has put this forward as a way, in principal part, of saving a lot of money for tax reform, basically. But it does have trade ramifications. It will affect trade flows that you must be analyzing.
Oh, absolutely. Anything that affects what goes across the border clearly has a trade implication. But it is meant to be part of an overall tax package. And so you have several issues. One is the question whether or not to do a border adjustable. Second is what magnitude of it is needed. And then third are the intricate details. How does it really work? If you're a solely domestic producer who does some exporting, that's one set of facts. If you're mainly an importer, a different one. If you're both, even more complicated. So it isn't a very simple thing to analyze. And because it's so important in such large numbers, as you know, they're talking about potentially $1 trillion over a 10-year period. That's way too big a number to get wrong.
I want to turn now briefly to Germany because Chancellor Merkel will be visiting Washington next week.
Yes.
There's been some discussion, not from you that I'm aware of, but some discussion from the administration about trade with Germany, where there is, again, a trade deficit. Will that be on the agenda for discussions with Angela Merkel?
My guess is that those discussions will be somewhat higher level than getting precisely into how many automobiles from Germany get sold here. I'd be very surprised if you got to that level of granularity in the discussions. It's also complicated in that Germany is not a separate entity. Trade relations with the outside world fundamentally come through the EU, so it's a little more complicated structurally dealing anything with Germany than with, say, Mexico or Canada.
And this is a point that Peter Navarro, who has a role on trade at the White House, made when recently he actually criticized Germany, saying they were getting an advantage in trade because they're part of the euro, which is artificially low, where if it were a Deutschmark again, it would be high. Is that part of trade policy for the U.S. government?
Well, currency is a factor in trade, clearly. And for example, with Mexico, the weakness of the peso has been a significant factor in trade. Peso is way down versus the dollar just this year, let alone prior years. So sure, that affects the relative competitiveness of countries.
But is it U.S. policy at this point that the euro is too weak against the dollar?
The currency matters are mostly dealt with by Treasury, not by commerce. And my plate's pretty full with what is on it. So I'm not going to go poaching food from other people's plate.
Finally, Mr. Secretary, does it strike you as ironic? You mentioned the peso being down this year. If you tracked how candidate Trump did in the polls, it had a direct relationship with the peso. A lot of the peso devaluation appears to be in response to President Trump getting elected. Is it ironic that the more successful he is, the more it drives down the peso and exacerbates the problem of the trade deficit?
Well, that's a complicated equation. I think what it does show is that markets tend to adjust to realities. And as the probability of the Trump presidency grew, clearly it had some implications for Mexico and others. And now that the Trump presidency is a reality, it has even more clear implications.